Charismatic Leadership Example 1, Elijah prays for rain. Elijah stood firm before King Ahab and declared, "Because of your corruption and your persecution of those who are faithful to the Lord, there will be no rain for several years." Elijah walked out of the palace gates into a vast, arid land, foreshadowing the drought he had prophesied. The sun was scorching, the earth was cracked, the crops were withered, and the livestock were thirsty. This lasted for 3 years. Elijah knelt on the top of Mount Carmel and prayed devoutly for rain, and clouds gradually appeared in the sky. As the rain poured down, soaking the cracked earth, Elijah thanked God for hearing his prayers and granting a miracle. Elijah demonstrated his qualities as a charismatic leader by relying on his unwavering faith in God, his ability to inspire emotional connections, and his ability to lead his people through faith and emotional strength in times of crisis, ultimately bringing about a miracle of rain that ended the drought. Charismatic Leadership Example 2, Elijah prays for the widow. Elijah approached the widow's dilapidated house, which was located in a small village where famine was severe. The widow said to Elijah, "I only have food for 1 day, but I trust in God and I am willing to host you for food and shelter." Elijah comforted her and said, "God will surely provide for you and your family." In her simple kitchen, the widow poured the last bit of oil and flour into the bowl, which miraculously kept filling up. In addition, a widow's son died of illness. She was very sad and asked Elijah to pray for her son. Elijah prayed earnestly for God's intervention, and the room was gradually filled with the power of the Holy Spirit. They prayed with faith and entrusted the result to God. Unexpectedly, a miracle happened. God resurrected him and the boy began to move. The widow's trust in Elijah resulted in a miracle, demonstrating the emotional appeal of his charismatic leadership and his ability to gain trust in difficult situations. Charismatic Leadership Model 3, Elijah's Testimony of Fire. On Mount Carmel, Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Call to your gods, and I will call to the Lord, and it is God who hears prayer and sends down fire." Elijah poured water on the altar as the Israelites and the prophets of Baal watched with curiosity. Suddenly, a pillar of fire descended from the sky and ignited the soaked altar. When the flames died down, the Israelites knelt in awe. Elijah walked along the dusty road with his faithful disciple Elisha by his side. Elijah said, "If you see how I am taken up by God, it means that he will pass on to you the mission and the power that he gave me." A whirlwind whipped up, a flaming chariot descended from heaven, and Elisha witnessed how Elijah was taken up to heaven. Elisha picked up Elijah's robe and prepared to take over Elijah's mission. Elijah's robe symbolized the transfer of leadership, and Elijah inspired Elisha to faithfully take over his mission, setting an example of charismatic leadership. Servant Leadership Example 1, David vs. Goliath. David fought the giant Goliath to save the Israelites. He walked towards the battlefield with a slingshot and a bag of stones in his hands, and the Israelite army behind him was uneasy and afraid. When David came face to face with Goliath, he was not intimidated by his huge size. David swung his slingshot and the stone flew out and hit Goliath, who fell to the ground dead. David bravely defended God's people and demonstrated the spirit of servant leadership. Servant Leadership Example 2, David shows compassion to King Saul. King Saul was afraid that David would replace him, so he desperately chased him. But David, fearing God, did not resist, but kept on fleeing until one day he found Saul sleeping. David carefully cut off a corner of Saul's robe with a knife. Later, he showed that corner to Saul as proof that he had not killed him even though he had the opportunity. David put the welfare of others first and demonstrated servant leadership when he chose mercy when he had the opportunity to kill King Saul, who was pursuing him. Servant Leadership Example 3, King David welcoming the Ark of the Covenant. The priests carried the Ark of the Covenant on long poles and approached the gate of Jerusalem. The musicians played music, and King David danced and sang in front of the crowd, not caring about his royal status at all. Queen Michal stood at the palace window and saw King David dancing. She felt that he had lost his royal dignity. Yet, King David still worshipped joyfully and celebrated the return of the Ark, not caring about his so-called royal dignity. King David ignored royal etiquette and other people's opinions and focused on glorifying God, demonstrating the dedication of a servant leader to a higher purpose. Servant leadership example 4, King David prepares materials for the temple. To ensure that the temple was ready for construction, King David directed the collection of gold, silver, precious stones, and wood in the courtyard. King David and his son Solomon unfold the temple plan scroll. King David delivered wise instructions, and Solomon listened carefully. Although King David was unable to build the temple himself, he actively paved the way for the next generation and set an example of servant leadership.